If you've ever felt that something is off about old cities, it might not just be a feeling. Because the closer you look at ancient streets, stone blocks, and buildings with buried floors, the harder it is to believe they were really built the way we're told. There are too many oddities, too many coincidences, and too many details that are usually glossed over. Why do old cities in different countries look as if they were assembled from the same template? Where did the traces of massive construction sites disappear? Why do houses have windows and doors that go underground? And most importantly, why does it feel like the first inhabitants of these places weren't the builders, but simply new owners of something that already existed before them? Today, we'll examine a version that shatters the familiar picture of the past, an uncomfortable version, at times frightening, and for many almost shameful, because it calls into question the very foundation of official history. And closer to the end, you'll face the heaviest question: not who built these cities, but who lived in them before us. Sometimes the most unsettling feeling doesn't come in ruins, among ancient debris, or in museums, but in the very heart of a living city, where cars hum, shop windows glow, and pedestrians rush by. You look at the old quarters, the straight streets, the heavy facades, the stone lines drawn so precisely, as if they weren't sketched by people in a hurry, but by someone who already knew the entire spatial design. And at some point, a strange thought arises. What if humanity didn't build all this from scratch? What if it simply moved into a ready-made environment? This thought sticks precisely because it sounds too uncomfortable. We've been taught a simple scheme since childhood. First, there were poor settlements. Then craftsmen appeared. Then streets, squares, bridges, administrative buildings grew, and step by step, a city emerged.
It all seems logical until you start examining the details. Because old cities too often give not the impression of long, uneven growth, but the feeling of a completed structure. Not a collection of random houses, but an integrated system where everything is already in its place. What's especially strange is how such cities are perceived as a whole. It's not one building, one tower, one palace that raises questions, but the entire environment at once. Streets run as if they were pre-aligned with water flow, human movement, squares, and access to key points. Stone volumes stand as if a single common plan was laid between them from the start. Even where later eras altered, built upon, repainted, and adapted things for themselves, an alien, older logic still shows through. That's why the feeling arises that we're dealing not with a birth, but with a settlement. As if someone once left behind a framework, and the next inhabitants simply occupied it, gave it new names, and began telling a story as if everything started with them. These spaces look too confident for a world that, according to the official version, was just taking its first steps. Too high a level of order, too much precision, too few traces of the chaos that usually accompanies beginnings. Of course, you could dismiss this as imagination. Say that people always want to see mystery where there's just stone, time, and beautiful architecture. But that explanation only works until you start noticing that this feeling arises again and again in different countries, different cities, different cultural zones. And then the main question is no longer where this unease comes from. The main question is different. If it's not just an impression, then what exactly causes it? Take the next step, and the strange feeling begins to rely not on intuition, but on a repeating pattern. Too much in old cities across different countries looks not just similar, but as if assembled from the same internal blueprint. Whether it's a European center, an old Russian town, or an ancient quarter in Asia, everywhere a familiar spatial logic emerges, one that seems independent of language, local traditions, or the official origin story. It's not even about external beauty. Beauty can be diverse. The strangeness lies elsewhere. Almost everywhere we see straight or remarkably precise streets, squares at key nodes, administrative or public buildings at points that seem pre-calculated, and the linkage of all this with water, bridges, elevation changes, and the flow of people. The city looks not like a random collection of buildings that grew haphazardly over centuries, but like a thought-out system where every element is integrated into a common design. This similarity becomes especially hard to ignore when you start looking not at individual monuments, but at the very principle of layout. Across different parts of the world, the same love for symmetry, axial lines, clear spatial division, and facades that function not on their own, but as part of a unified ensemble repeats. It creates the impression that we're not seeing many different stories, but traces of the same approach, simply adapted to local stone, climate, and terrain. Official history explains this through borrowing, the influence of fashion, trade development, the work of architects who adopted successful solutions from each other. At first glance, it sounds reasonable, but the wider you look, the stronger the question becomes. Isn't this coincidence too vast? How did societies with different levels of development, different capabilities, and different speeds of knowledge exchange repeatedly arrive at almost the same urban formula? When one detail matches, it's a coincidence. When dozens of elements match, it's a system. And here, the familiar picture begins to crack. Because if old cities truly obeyed one common principle, then it's not just about architectural taste. Then we might be looking at the remnant of a deeper model, the trace of something already finished, inherited, not newly invented. And to understand how serious this is, we need to look not at facades, but at what lies beneath them, the stone foundation of these cities. And here is where things get most uncomfortable. While your gaze glides over facades, you can still argue about tastes, styles, and fashions of different eras. But once you look lower, to the base of old cities, the usual explanation begins to wobble. Beneath later plaster, rebuilt floors, new roofs, and decorative details, something far heavier, more powerful, and seemingly originally designed for a completely different level of construction is too often discovered. In many old neighborhoods, it's the lower parts of buildings that make the strongest impression. This isn't a lightweight addition or haphazard stonework. These are massive foundations, huge blocks, thick walls, arches, and plinths, assembled with such precision, it's as if they weren't built in haste, but to a pre-existing standard. Sometimes the upper part of a house looks noticeably simpler, weaker, even poorer. The base, on the contrary, seems built with an excessive safety margin, as if meant to withstand centuries of alterations. It's this contrast that is most unsettling. If these are buildings that grew gradually, why is their earliest, deepest part often the most perfect? Why does the foundation seem more thoughtfully designed than what was added later? Logic suggests the opposite. Society starts simpler, cruder, weaker, and only later, with accumulated experience and technology, reaches a higher level. But in old cities, we too often see a different picture, as if later generations didn't improve the foundation, but merely used what was already standing before them. This heaviness is almost palpable. The old stone foundations don't look like the work of poor, scattered settlements just beginning to coalesce into a town. They look as if the builders perfectly understood load, perspective, durability, and the overall spatial plan. there's no sense of a temporary solution. On the contrary, everything is done as if the calculations were made from the start for a large system, for streets, squares, drainage, dense construction, and the long life of the entire urban framework. And the more closely you look at this stone base, the harder it is to accept the simple version of primitive tools and almost manual labor. The scale is too great. The geometry is too confident. The safety margin is too serious. And if all this was indeed created by those presented to us as the first builders, then a completely different question arises. Where are the traces of the colossal effort without which such construction simply couldn't have happened? And here, the old picture truly begins to fall apart. Because any large stone city isn't just walls, arches, and squares. It's also a colossal construction site, which must have left behind very earthly traces. Supply roads, quarries, warehouses, workshops, temporary housing for workers, traces of stone processing, remnants of mechanisms, descriptions of labor organization. When it's a matter of a few houses, much can still be explained. But when we're faced with entire neighborhoods, the question becomes pointed. Where is everything that must have accompanied such construction? We are asked to believe that vast quantities of stone were quarried, transported, fitted, and lifted almost by hand, with the era's rather modest capabilities. But then, around the old centers, traces of this titanic work should be discernible. Not isolated hints, but an entire infrastructure, without which it's impossible to create an urban base on such a scale. And the larger the city, the more visible this construction machinery should have been. But most often, we see only the finished result, as if the intermediate stages were carefully edited out of the frame. The stone mass is there, but its long, noisy, heavy history seems absent. This is what breeds the most uncomfortable suspicion. What if the first inhabitants truly weren't the builders of the main structure? What if their role was much simpler and, at the same time, stranger? To arrive, occupy, adapt, give a name, and begin living inside what already existed before them. And if such a thought seems even momentarily possible, then old chronicles and dry formulations about city foundations start to sound different. They too often speak of the appearance of authority, a name and status, but almost nothing about the actual process of the city's stone body being born. The more carefully you read old descriptions of cities, the more one peculiarity stands out. They constantly say that a city was founded, received a name, became a center of power, acquired status, a coat of arms, a ruler. But behind these formulas, there's almost always a void, where the most important story should be. How exactly its heavy stone foundation arose? Who erected the massive quarters? How materials were hauled? How the work was organized? How a complex urban environment emerged from a scattered settlement? Instead, sources often sound as if the main event wasn't construction, but the act of taking possession. People arrive, establish themselves, allocate space, give names to streets and squares, adapt buildings to their needs, and begin to consider that moment the start of history. As if the city existed before, but only entered the chronicles when a new authority, a new community, or a new master appeared within it.
This changes the perspective almost instantly. Viewed this way, many oddities cease to be accidental. Then, the high starting point of the first inhabitants no longer looks miraculous. They didn't need to create the entire system from scratch. It was enough for them to enter a ready-made shell, occupy convenient points, modify what was necessary for life, and gradually declare it their civilization. This is why old cities so often give the impression not of a space being born, but of one being occupied. Not a fresh construction site, but an environment entered into later. And if this feeling isn't deceptive, then the traces should be visible in the buildings themselves. Not in beautiful legends or solemn foundation dates, but in the walls, windows, floors, and in those alterations that betray not the first creator, but a later user. It's in the buildings themselves that this version starts to sound especially loud. If you look at old houses not as museum pieces, but as layered structures, it becomes clear. What we often see is not a unified edifice created from a single design, but the result of later adjustments to a pre-existing base. The top and bottom speak different languages. The lower part is heavy, strict, designed for a long-term load. The upper part is lighter, simpler, sometimes even clumsier, as if it wasn't created together with the foundation, but added later when a new need arose. Hence the feeling of alteration, which is hard to miss. In some places, windows look as if they were cut through after the wall was assembled. Elsewhere, doorways seem inscribed into an already finished volume. Somewhere, floors were added as if the previous height of the building no longer suited the new inhabitants. And sometimes, even the very logic of the facade changes. The lower level maintains one geometry, while the upper level follows completely different rules. This doesn't look like smooth construction from scratch, it looks like adaptation. This effect is especially strong where an old stone framework has survived several eras in a row. Each new generation seems not to have created the building anew, but to have argued with what already stood before it, added its own, cut away the excess, remodeled the interior, but left the foundation itself untouched because it was too powerful, too convenient, too stable to abandon. And here a new troubling detail emerges. If people in different places weren't truly building everything from scratch, but were merely settling into spaces they inherited, then identical traces of such adaptation should appear not in just one city, but across vast distances. And this is precisely what we begin to see when we compare architecture in places where it would seem there should be too little in common. And here, the picture expands beyond a single city and starts to look not like a local oddity, but like something much larger. Because identical features surface where, according to the official narrative, they shouldn't match so precisely. Arches, columns, domes, strict symmetry, elongated facades, the same fondness for axial lines, for ceremonial spaces, for the precise rhythm of windows and openings. All of this is found in countries with different histories, climates, and cultural environments. Yet the feeling is the same, as if we're not looking at a set of independent traditions, but an echo of a common language. Of course, one could say architects borrowed ideas from each other, that fashions spread across continents, that successful solutions were repeated again and again. But this explanation falls short when what repeats is not just one detail, but the very logic of the form. Too often, it's not the ornament that coincides, but the framework of thought. Not an isolated column, but the entire principle by which space is assembled. Not a random facade, but a whole system where the building, the street, and the square function as parts of a single design. And then an uncomfortable question arises.
What if this is not the mark of fashion, but the remnant of a once common blueprint? What if the foundation of old cities was not a local search, but a ready-made template known much earlier and much more widely than is commonly believed? Such a template could have survived the disappearance of its creators, with later inhabitants merely repeating familiar forms, no longer understanding their original meaning. This is precisely why the similarity of old cities is so unsettling. It's too systematic to easily dismiss. And if this unified language truly existed, then we must look for its traces not only in facades and squares. The most telling signs should remain where later life could not completely conceal the old foundation, in the lower levels of buildings, which seem to have simply sunk into the ground one day. It is perhaps the lower levels of old buildings that produce the strangest impression. They are habitually called basements, ground floors, service areas. But upon closer inspection, this version begins to crack. All too often, what we see is not a cramped utility space, but a full-fledged floor with high windows, wide openings, traces of a proper entrance, and architecture clearly not designed for darkness and dampness. A simple question arises. Why build underground something that originally looks like a normal residential or public level? This looks especially suspicious where windows are half buried in the soil, where arches are cut off by the current street level, where doors have been turned into blind niches, and the lines of the old facade seem to continue downward, into the earth, into a space no one now descends into, as if it were originally open. If this really was a basement, it's too ornate, too tall, and too well integrated into the building's overall composition. And if it's not a basement, then the picture becomes far more troubling. Then it turns out that the ground level was once different, lower. And what today looks like a sunken lower tier was once a normal part of city life. Light came through these windows. People entered through these doors. This floor wasn't hidden under a mass of earth. It was open, visible, and part of the street's rhythm. But later, something changed, and an entire layer of the old city was buried, as if the surface rose long after the buildings were already in place. And if that's the case, then we're no longer talking about a minor architectural oddity, but an event of a much larger scale. Because then, it wasn't individual houses that changed, but the urban environment itself. Which means the next question is inevitable. What exactly happened to these cities after their appearance, if entire floors one day sank down beneath the feet of new inhabitants? Once you allow that the lower floors were once an open part of the street, the entire conversation changes sharply. It's no longer enough to marvel at strange windows underground. One has to ask a much heavier question. What happened to the cities themselves if their familiar level was once buried under a new layer of surface? There are many theories here, and each is uncomfortable in its own way. One can speak of the gradual accumulation of soil, of repeated layers of debris, of reconstructions, street raising, and later urban adaptation. This sounds calm and even plausible when talking about isolated areas. But when a similar picture repeats in different places, in different countries, and in very old districts, the explanation no longer seems so simple. The effect looks far too systematic, as if we're dealing not with the mundane accumulation of layers,
but with something more extensive. What's especially strange is that the cities don't look razed to the ground. On the contrary, there's a sense that the foundation survived, but the level of life around it changed. People didn't rebuild the entire city from scratch. They seemed to accept the new surface as a given and began to adapt. Somewhere they bricked up old entrances. Somewhere they built new stairs. Somewhere they turned the former lower floor into a basement, and over time came to believe it had always been that way. This is a very important point. What we see is not the birth of a city, but its second life. Not the beginning of history, but a stage after some major shift, about which almost no clear account remains. And the more you study this silent restructuring of space, the clearer it becomes. Modern man lives not in the original city, but in its altered version. And perhaps this is precisely why old districts so often evoke a strange internal feeling. Not just interest, not just admiration, but a barely perceptible discomfort, as if these spaces were originally assembled according to rules we no longer fully understand. This feeling is familiar to many, even if it's hard to name at first. An old city can amaze, attract, fascinate, but along with that, it often feels oppressive. Not with fear in the literal sense, but with a kind of internal tension. Narrow streets seem to squeeze the space. Tall facades loom as if designed not for the light, modern rhythm, but for a completely different perception of the environment. Squares sometimes seem too strict, too precise, as if humans are allotted a place here not as masters, but as participants in an already established order. This sensation is particularly interesting. If old cities had truly been born gradually, shaped by the needs of their first inhabitants, they should look more alive, uneven, accidental. But in many historic centers, the opposite is felt. The space seems assembled with cold precision. There is beauty in it, but this beauty is not always cozy. It disciplines, directs, subjects movement to a pattern laid down long before us. This leads to a strange thought, one usually left unspoken. What if these cities were originally designed not for the kind of person we're used to seeing in history textbooks, not for a poor, scattered community just learning to build a complex environment, but for a different way of life, a different density of living, a different scale of thinking? Perhaps this is why old districts often seem both beautiful and alien. We recognize them as a city, but we don't fully feel they are ours. And the stronger this feeling, the more important another detail becomes. Such cities don't just sit on the land. They are often integrated into it with astonishing precision. The terrain, water, elevations, street directions, key vantage points, all of it looks not like a blind conquest of territory, but like the confident work of those who understood in advance how the entire spatial pattern should lay upon the earth itself. It is this very precision that undermines the usual explanation. Old cities too often sit on the land as if they weren't groped for blindly, but were immediately fitted into an already understood scheme. Streets lead to where they are truly needed. Squares are placed at nodes that control movement and views. Water doesn't just flow nearby, it's incorporated into the overall order. changes in elevation don't hinder, but contribute to the entire spatial pattern. One gets the impression that the terrain here wasn't conquered by guesswork, but was used with a full understanding of its logic. This is especially noticeable where the city seems to grow from the very earth. It doesn't fight the landscape, doesn't break it over its knee, but settles onto it so naturally, as if the blueprint existed even before the first inhabitants, who then only had to occupy the ready-made lines. There is too much precision here for random growth, too much calculation for spontaneous development. And the longer you look at this interplay of streets, heights, water, and stone, the harder it becomes to believe it all came together by itself, step by step, without a single grand design. Yet, it is the grand design that is the most inconvenient word here, because it immediately shatters the comfortable schoolbook picture where history moves from the bottom up, from simple to complex, from a poor settlement to a developed city. If old centers really were arranged with such confidence from the very start, then someone possessed not only construction skills, but also a knowledge of space at a level that later seemed to vanish. This is why such questions are rarely pursued to the end. Too much begins to wobble at once, and if all the familiar history isn't as solid as it seems, then the most unsettling question remains. Not how these cities were built, but who came to them before us. And here we are left with a question that can no longer be simply brushed aside. What if we are truly not the first? What if humanity has entered a world more than once, where much was prepared in advance? Cities, streets, stone frameworks, and engineering logic that the new inhabitants didn't create, but merely accepted as a given. Then history looks completely different. Not like a smooth line of development, but like a tape with lost fragments, where some epochs seem to overlay others, erasing the traces of those who came before. Then many things fall into place. The identical architecture in distant countries, the heavy foundations that don't resemble the work of poor early communities, the buried lower floors, the strange feeling that the old city isn't entirely ours, as if we are living inside someone's long-abandoned order. Perhaps new generations simply renamed the streets, changed the facades, rebuilt the upper tiers, and declared themselves the first, while the true depth of this history remained underfoot, beneath layers of earth, plaster, and later explanations. The most unsettling thing about this version isn't even that there could have been someone else before us. The most unsettling thing is that the traces of this past are still right beside us, yet we look at them as a familiar backdrop. We walk on streets we possibly didn't create. We live in cities whose original logic we no longer fully understand. And we call a beginning what might just be another repetition. And the more attentively you look at old cities, the harder it is to shake off one thought. Perhaps humanity hasn't so much built civilization as it has repeatedly resettled into its surviving shells. If this version of history resonates with you, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next analyses. It's going to get even more interesting. See you next time.